Kia ora tātou, talo falava, malo e molele, warm Pacific greetings to you all, and howdy. Now, I wish to welcome our Pro-VC, Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of Auckland, Associate Professor Toeolesulusulu, Damon Salesa, to our LIANZA Conference 2019. Whaatalo whātu I lawa whionga, Toeolesulusulu, Damon Salesa. Susu mai, awhio mai, haere mai, nau mai, piki mai, are mai. Associate Professor Toeolesulusulu Damon Salesa argues that the Pacific is not out there. It is right here in the earlier migrants and new generations of Pacific New Zealanders born here, and in Aotearoa New Zealand as a Pacific nation. When asked that question by so many, where are you from? He's likely to say Aotearoa New Zealand, but where are you really from? A, Mount Wellington? But where were you born? Auckland? We are Pacific and we are home. This stand explored in his recent, or one of his recent books, and it's the one coming out, I was just talking to him, Island Time, challenges to New Zealanders to rethink the Pacific in us all. Fasten your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen, for a journey into some of our own existing beliefs and perhaps outdated ideas about Pacific Aotearoa. Where have we come from and where we are going? And as we welcome Toeolesulusulu Damon Salesa onto the floor to present to us and talanoa to us about colouring in some of those white spaces in narratives and in texts. A whio mai lau whionga.
Whakatalofa atu kia koutou, Tokelau Language Week. We think of that beautiful place. And as many of you all know, that is the northernmost part of New Zealand. So we think of the parts of New Zealand where it is warmest, and that is Tokelau. A whio mai tala mai, a ao, ma lole sofua, ma lange mama, kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for inviting me along today and for your attention and for all the work you do in libraries. Libraries have been very special to me and librarians have been very special to me, so I'm definitely pro-library and pro-librarian. I wanted to talk today, sort of riffing off that, and acknowledging the particular work that's coming about in New Zealand through our librarians. I know that we have the Pacifica Information Management Network as part of LIANZA, and so I wanted particularly to acknowledge that network under the leadership of Judy and Richard Messilei, as well as the other Pacific information specialists who are part of it. And I've got a talk that's really in three parts, and hopefully with time for questions. The first part is really thinking about the relationship between Pacific people and libraries and texts. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, the Bible tells us. And the relationship Pacific people have with God is mediated by, above all, the Bible, meaning it is mediated by the written Word. And that relationship means that literacy is very, very special to Pacific people. I say these things because often we default to a position where Pacific people are not readers. And actually Pacific people are readers, and in the 1830s, as we'll see, the Pacific was one of the most literate places on earth. Pacific people wanted the Word, the written Word. When missionaries first came to the Pacific, they were initially very unsuccessful. We saw missions in places like Tonga, New Zealand and Tahiti fail in their first attempt, sometimes for decades. And actually, the reason it succeeded to the extent it did at the beginning was because Missionaries had things like crops, access to capital, knowledge, tools, and even guns. But the real success for the missionaries came when they wrote down the word. That was the turning point in the Christian history, particularly of Polynesia, but also in Micronesia and Melanesia as well. And of course, when missionaries wrote down the word, they really wrote it in just a few texts. The most obvious ones were the Bible. And so throughout most of our Pacific homes and our Pacific languages more broadly, the chief, and in some cases the only, widely spread published text is the Bible. So the Samoan Bible, o le tusi paia, has this distinctive history that tracks the relationship of Samoans to the written word. Very, very rapidly in Samoa, they write down the Samoan language because they have already been able to write down the Cook Island language, Rarotongan. And then they begin this 30-year project of completing the translation of the Bible. And when that Bible is finally complete, it's published in London and is, of course, the best-selling book by any measure in Samoa. So if there's any doubts about the way Samoans and what esteem Samoans hold the written text, and there's a part of Samoa where they've literally built a monument to where this work was completed. So there's monuments to the book, both the big letter B book and the small letter B book. Similar story for the Tohitapu, the Tongan Bible. Right. It took longer, this piece of work, but this process goes on throughout the Pacific and actually produces generations and generations of Pacific readers. I think this is really important, and I share this so you may share it with others, other young Pacific people, to remind them that they sit in a genealogy of rapacious readers. Throughout the Pacific, Polynesian readers in particular desired more and more to read. And in fact, missionaries would not go anywhere without written texts, because without them, they were often not welcome. Right. In most parts of the Pacific, in the first batch of missionaries, one of the people is a printer, so that the work can be done. So that in the very first boat of missionaries in both Samoa and Tonga, there's printers who bring a printing press ready to spread the word. That also means that most of the people who learn to read in the Pacific actually don't learn from those foreign missionaries. They learn from other Pacific people. Right? It is Pacific people who teach other Pacific people how to read. There is a revolution that begins really in the 1820s and 1830s, a Polynesian revolution of literacy. That means not just that there are things to read, but people learn how to read and people learn how to teach reading. Perhaps the most drastic example is this man, Taufa'ahau, as he becomes later the first king of Tonga, who was one of these that learnt very rapidly to read, proving what many educational theorists have said, that motivated learners can learn to read in a matter of weeks, not years. Right. And he actually learnt by literally writing on the beach with a stick. Right. So literacy didn't sit as some sort of invasion of Pacific and Polynesian cultures. It was an essential part of it from the very beginning. Literacy was something that did transform local knowledge systems, and it reconfigured some of them, but actually facilitated culture and language. Right. Learning to read in Samoan actually heightened people's sense of the language. Right. Literacy was like guns and cloth and boats, a technology that people could use to their own ends. It wasn't an eraser that just rubbed things out as it went along. The challenge really was not the learning to read, not the creating a written language, but actually producing a book culture to sit alongside it. And that has probably been the lasting challenge in the Pacific. Not literacy, not willingness to read, but that challenge of a book culture, and particularly a library culture. And I think the history of libraries as many of you will know, are quite interesting in this because many of them were designed to be exclusive spaces, to keep people out. Right. The first libraries in most of the colonised world were not for colonised people. They were for the colonisers, and they were places of refinement. And that only began to change when sort of the working men's clubs and that movement of mass reading began in Europe. Even though in the 1830s and 1840s, for instance, most Samoans were probably able to read by the 1850s, right, at a time when most English people were not able to read. So there was mass reading, mass literacy in the Pacific, even though there was no libraries. So when the public libraries finally arrive, there's very few of them in the Pacific. Right. Most of the reading happens in people's homes, and particularly in churches. And even now, along with this transition to once again a free and independent Pacific, there are very few libraries. Right. Whole countries do not have a public library in the Pacific. So it's quite a striking thing to weigh that particular absence of a written, of a library culture with an absolute commitment to literacy, reading, and the word. One of the wonderful things about my research is this ability to see the letters of our ancestors. So at the back here we have a letter from Malietoa and Tupua in 1914. Ali'i, it reads, the Ali'i they're writing to is Kaiser Wilhelm, who they're declaring their loyalty to. They had $1 each way in this one. And this wonderful letter here, which is in a private collection, but the private collector has allowed images to be taken, is a letter written actually by Tau Whahau, right? Where he declares in one of my favourite phrases that everyone should just butt out because Tongans and Samoans are what he calls one people, right? So remember that, Tongans and Samoans. So we are the children in the Pacific of writers of letters particularly, but also of authors. Probably the first published Tongan author is this man on your left, Toeolesulusulu, who was a missionary that left Tonga to missionise in Fiji. And on the right is probably the first published Samoan author, Laulii Willis, who published a monograph in 1881. So there's this extraordinary history of literacy, of writing, of telling Pacific narratives in this new medium that dates back, well, pretty much 200 years. And what's really interesting about it is the struggle to use the word and literacy to produce social change. Where is the kind of public sphere for Pacific nations? This has been one of the great challenges because colonialism wanted to redefine what was public. So that was, for instance, a town square or a city square, a city hall. But for Pacific people, the public, what we might think of as public, were places like the villages, the marae, the whono, mauta, right? Places that aren't actually public in the European sense. They're subject to particular norms and controls. And so the colonial attempt to create a public was effectively an attempt to lessen or even erase these other places of indigenous exchange. And one of those places where this contest between a colonial vision of a public and an indigenous vision of a shared community space was actually in writing. Across the Pacific, pretty much as quickly as people could get paper to print on, newspapers came around. And actually in this wonderful initiative, the Turnbull Library, as many of you will know, has digitised not only the Māori nuhipaper, but have actually digitised several runs of Samoan newspapers. So this contest in the Pacific has a written form, newspapers. It has print cultures combating in the church as Catholic churches and Protestant churches publish to each criticise the other. But there's very few opportunities, commercial opportunities, to publish. So what we don't see in the Pacific, for instance, is the rise of fiction, right? Because of this association between the word, the Christian word, and the written text, right? Fiction is not something that mission presses do. And many of you will know that across the world, the first thing Protestant missionaries publish after they publish the Bible, whether it's Africa or the Pacific or parts of Asia, is the Pilgrim's Progress, a Pilgrim's Progress. So something that is held to be literally true, right? So inside the Pacific, there isn't a word for fiction in almost any language that's making stuff up. And so literacy becomes much more closely connected to truth, a kind of literal truth or a verisimilitude. And of course, writing starts to produce governments. The most radical example of that is the constitutions written for Hawaii and Tonga. So written documents that literally call nations into being. Right. There is no nation of Tonga until the Constitution is written. The Constitution defines it. It outlines its laws, land tenure, all those things. Right. So the law, the word, the Christian word is then married with this sense of law, and both of them are written down. So there's a particular sense and commitment to truth in writing, and there's a particular sense that writing has mana, that is not empty, it's meaningful. So the Pacific passion for education that we see across East, West, North Pacific is closely associated with this as well, right? The church form the aristocrats of the schools of education. So pastors are the most literate people typically in the Pacific. And then, of course, they run the schools, right? And it's the schools that produce the mass literacy in the Pacific, as they do elsewhere. But in the Pacific, schools are not public schools. They're almost exclusively church schools, right? So the church, once again, is associated with the written word and this passion for education and the formation of schools. It is schools, the missions believe, that will chase out heathenism, and many of them think it will chase out Catholicism. But at the same time, as they have a commitment to literacy, these schools are quite unacademic in the sense that they're not training people to go to university, they're not training them to have sort of abstract knowledge, they're training them to have a practical knowledge. So yes, you should learn to read, but not too much, right? And so this is the school system that Pacific countries inherit at independence. School systems that aren't designed to produce lawyers and accountants, people who run governments. School systems that are designed to produce farmers and wives, right? So it's a very different thing. And I think this kind of backstory to Pacific literacy is incredibly important because it describes so much about New Zealand's current predicament. I know that seems like a long bow to draw, but if you imagine that in many parts of the Pacific, at the time that nations become independent, whole nations do not have functioning secondary schools, right? Primary school education is all you can get in Samoa, the Cook Islands, Niue, effectively, when New Zealand decolonises. Those people are not being trained and educated to come to New Zealand and become lawyers, right? They've actually been produced generation after generation to do manual, unskilled labour, right? So New Zealand, along with its other colonising partners like Australia, the United States, Britain, France, have spent a lot of time almost fighting the power of the written word to make sure that they're producing largely uneducated Pacific people. It is really only in the last 2 generations that most Pacific nations have had consistent and persistent secondary education, which is why the kind of capacity to tell stories, sophisticated stories, diverse stories, has been quite limited in the Pacific. So if we imagine this particular case with a deep history of literacy, which is, at the same time was quite truncated because of colonialism, and then meeting an incredibly sophisticated and rapidly changing digital world, we find ourselves at the rough intersection that most of you work at, right? Where we sit in a digital revolution at a time when other revolutions are not yet complete, like our decolonizing revolution, for instance. What that means is that in a place like Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, pretty much most of the Pacific we can name, the first phone most people owned was not just a cell phone, it was actually a smartphone. So in 1997, for instance, there were 12,000 phones in Samoa. In 2017, there were 200,000, right? That's actually what a revolution looks like. And amongst the many things that it is, it's a revolution in literacy. It's one that's been driven not by, the institutions of the Pacific, like churches and schools. It's actually one of the few revolutions we've seen in the Pacific that's been driven by the market. So what enabled the digital revolution in the Pacific was the deregulation of telecommunications in the late 1990s. And all of a sudden you have relatively inexpensive, actually quite well-connected handheld computers, which made this revolution, unlike most others, a distributed revolution, which meant that Pacific people could forge new connections with new content and new services. So we sit in a world of new Pacific literacies, right? I call it the digital Pacific, right? Well, there should be a hashtag in there, which is what you should do when you're tweeting it. That means there's much greater access to content making and sharing than we've seen before, right? And that this particular literacy is now occurring, in a generation whose parents did not have mostly phones, reliable electricity, or even televisions, many of them. They now have this access to all sorts of multimedia and short-form communications. So it's actually a really exciting time to be a Pacific specialist and to be a Pacific person. And I think we can see also that this is meant because most of these people don't come with other infrastructures, right? So you're not displacing a whole lot of copper lines because there weren't any. We're actually seeing in the Pacific a new kind of leadership. And if some of you will know who these people are, some of you won't. Now, the reason that's up there is because New Zealand's most important digital media personality is on the screen, right? So the most followed New Zealander on social media is KJ Apa, right? And depending on whose metric you use, 3 of the 10 most followed New Zealanders are Pacific people, right? Which is totally out of kilter with the Pacific numbers. So we look at this and we think, wow, the new social medias, the new digital revolution is profoundly Pacific. And on the one hand, we should, I think, celebrate this. What we've seen in social media is that Pacific people have made social media distinctly Pacific. I had a very talented student who ran the world's largest survey of Samoan Facebook use. And this is one of the sets of data from that. This is actually unusual. Samoans do not use Facebook like everyone else, right? So this particular graph shows that almost 3/4 of the friends that Samoans have are people they already know, right, on social media. That is actually not the case in studies of social media. And certainly it's not the case, as it is with Samoans, that 2/3 of their friends on Facebook are their relatives, which is a distinctly Samoan position. So what we see is that Pacific people, obviously Samoans in this, but more broadly, have made social media a distinctively Pacific enterprise. But that has hit pretty quick limits. Many of us, especially in the Pacific, both the Pacific in the region and Pacific people in New Zealand, were really excited that the digital world would present more opportunities to read, more content, that it would be next to free, that would see the development of new forms for buttressing Pacific languages. We'd see a return to first language use by Pacific people, and we'd see less mediation of individuals by their family context, right? Many of us really thought if everyone's got a really powerful camera in their pocket and a computer and is connected, that we're going to see all sorts of new content, right? And so that was the promise. But actually, it hit the reality of the digital world pretty quickly in the Pacific. So within about 10 years, we saw that just a handful of companies controlled most of the traffic on the internet. I was told by the chief exec of Samoa's largest telecom company that 50% of Samoa's internet traffic is Facebook, right? 50%. So Facebook is the new sheriff in town, so to speak. Some others have yet to wander into the Pacific, but we know how powerful they are. We know that we've seen massive transfers of revenue to offshore companies in New Zealand. And that actually many of us who imagined, not really me, but many people did imagine that we'd see a new age of a democratic world through digitality. Actually, what we saw was another divide that mapped other inequalities. So we saw that there's a digital divide which remains very real. That's a divide that's driven by cost, by access, by device, by speed, by levels of trust and levels of digital literacy. And so we find ourselves as people who care about reading and about libraries at this intersection of a new Pacific world that at the same time as it looks a lot like the people who are not Pacific are experiencing is actually quite different. Now for my next slide, I told Judy that I didn't think the librarians wanted to hear from me again because I spoke at this conference just a few years ago. And I particularly said something because I hadn't realised that the LIANZA conference last time was going to be at Sky City, a place that many of us have very strong feelings about. And I was a bit shocked that librarians would go there. And I guess the counterweight to that is how happy I am to see you here, right? To be in a place of New Zealand's future, to be really at ground zero of New Zealand's scientific and industrial future, right? I know that's not how everyone sees South Auckland, but that's what it is, right? New Zealand's major industries and the centre of our universe, which is Mangere Airport, within a stone's throw of here, right? And I wanted to mark our commitment to this place by sharing a new kind of digital literacy where we have seen a growth in Pacific expression and reach.
Well, as you'll see, it's an unusual story. And a story that begins on the streets of South Auckland.
278, you already know. It ain't really much to look at, but it's home. Used to bus from the old bar, which was to go in the town, rolling through the odor, who dead both. Think of how we ended up here. Ain't no secret that some people doing tough here. Could be rough here if your parents come here from an island in the hope of a better life for the child and an education. But they ain't got time to keep an eye on them. They working every day, they won't ever see retirement. School don't teach you to deal with this environment. Another poly kid left to his own devices, and you look at what they reinforce. When they talk about us doing crime, playing sports, standing at the goal line or in the court, think it don't affect the soul. Look at boys from the south side. If you looking from the outside, some scared to death when they see us, cause every 10, 7, 8 featuring boys from the south side. But we represent it with pride. When you feel you come from the bottom till you reach the top, ain't no stopping the boys from the south side. It's about time. All the people talking shit now, figure out why this town is so influential. The real melting pot, immigration central.
So that's David Dallas' South Side, which is a lyric about this place. And I think for me that offers the leverage to the next part of the talk I want to step into now, which is having discussed a bit about our future and this digital conjuncture we find ourselves in. I want to talk about the future, right? In my book, Island Time, I particularly use this Samoan proverb. Le ua nā awhua mai manua. The rain came from Manua. This is a saying, and there in the far east you see Manua, which is the 3 islands that are the most eastern in Samoa. The idea that if the rain is coming from Manua, you should have seen it coming, right? You've had enough warning, it's been coming for a long time. Now, I actually think this is a really prescient thing to say because the fundamental changes we now see in New Zealand have been coming for a long time. And it is now raining, right? And it is raining hard. And we're faced with this kind of two double sense of the future that I draw from Peter Drucker. One is that there's a future that's already happened, right? That there's nothing any of us can do about to change. Nothing that any of us can do to change it, right? Some big things have been coming for a long time and they're going to happen whether you like it or not. But that does leave us with this question of a future that we can make happen, which is much more of a limited, still a strategic future, where we can do things to ensure that that future that has already happened is made effective and work to our advantage. This is the right place to think about that, right, here in South Auckland, because last year was a very special year in New Zealand's history. So probably for the first time since the 1860s, most of the babies born in New Zealand were not Pākehā. Right. That happened last year. Didn't happen on the news, but it happened. Right. That is a future that has already happened. There is nothing you can do about that. Right. Those babies that were born last year will be 20 years old in 20 years' time, and they will be here whether you like it or not. Right. Of course I like it. And those of us for whom these are their children, of course we love it. Yeah. So that change has already happened. It's particularly marked in Auckland, right, where not even 40% of the babies born were Pākehā babies. So the far and away majority of the babies born were Māori, Pacific, and Asian. And our very, very flawed census, which was so flawed that the statistics didn't want to release it, still shows some of those changes are not quite as we think. So many of you will know that only 2/3 of Pacific people filled out the census. So it is the least reliable census we've had, well, in decades, maybe even 100 years. What we're seeing is that Pacific people, who were once an Auckland and Wellington population, by and large, are now not. So if we actually look at the percentage growth, which is the line, versus the numeric growth, we'll see that, yes, most of the numeric growth happened in Auckland, on the far left, but actually many other parts of New Zealand saw exponential increases in Pacific people. And if you can see the names of those places, many of you might be surprised. The one that saw a 300% increase in Pacific population in the last 3 censuses is Waitaki. Yeah. Waimakariri. So this means places that once upon a time didn't think the Pacific was them, find they too have a Pacific future, right? So we might do just that graph of the percentage growth, and we realise that Auckland's growth over 3 censuses is quite striking. So 37% growth in Pacific people, but it is nothing on all these other places in New Zealand, from Tauranga to literally Invercargill, right? So Pacific people are bringing this future, and they're bringing it to parts of New Zealand where we never saw it, right? And that future is happening, and it's already happened. The defining kind of question for New Zealand is going to be around what we do with these young people and whether we are able to reach their potential, right? Because the future is already here, and the best place to see it is in our retirement communities, right? So if you go to your retirement communities from Waimakariri to Kapiti Coast, you will see that those places are filled with elderly Pākehā people being cared for by young Māori, Pacific and Asian workers. Right? It's almost a universal. You know, even in the regions you see this. We know this is quite striking. We can represent it numerically by median ages. So the median age of Pacific people is 22. That means half of Pacific people are under 22. The median age for Pākehā is about 43, meaning half of Pākehā are over 43. So if New Zealand does not get this bit right, where those young people who are disproportionately Māori, Pacific and Asian reach their potential, then these retirement communities are not going to be nice places to live, right? Because the future of New Zealand's economy, its institutions, and its society rests with these babies that were born this year, right? 50% of whom are Māori and Pacific and Asian. So we might ask then, and we might ask this of our libraries as I ask of our universities and our hospitals and our schools. We've known this change was coming for a long time, right? Stats has projected this change almost to perfection, that this was going to happen. Came a little earlier than a kind of mid-range estimate. So if we knew this change was coming, what have we done differently knowing it was coming, right? And if we asked ourselves, you know, honestly, what are we doing now that we weren't doing 10 or 20 years ago because the kids are going to be different and already are different? I think many of us would probably find our own answers unsatisfactory, right? There have been some parts of New Zealand that have experienced rapid change, right? The example I use is, for instance, in rugby, right? On a rugby field in New Zealand, especially we think of the rugby fields perhaps in Japan more at the moment, if we look at that rugby field, it is filled with Māori and Pacific people, right? But if we look at who's running rugby, who's in the coach's box, who's in the governing positions, the corporate positions, we'll realise that the players look nothing like the rest of rugby, right? And so actually there's a leadership challenge that hasn't been met in most of New Zealand, where we still have our old style leaders. So we have a journey to make, right? I think some parts of New Zealand have made this journey quite rapidly, and actually New Zealand people have made it quite rapidly because perhaps the place which is most like the babies who are just born at the moment is New Zealand's cabinet, where almost the majority of New Zealand's ministers are Māori and Pacific, right? That happened, and it's kind of a function of other things, but it shows that change can happen quite quickly. And to me, it's not really an accident that we have a different, a Māori and Pacific government, and then we have different governing initiatives, things that could not have happened 20 or 30 years ago, things like whānau ora, a wellbeing budget. These are representations of a very different way of going about familiar work. So we do need to ask on our journey, on our malanga, who our leaders are, right? Have they changed as we have changed? Will they change as we are changing? We have to start with us, and that often requires really deep reflection, right? It requires some hard yards, some deep commitments. How serious are we to making the kinds of changes we need to make, right? I like the phrase that Mau Piulug used as a navigator when he was teaching David Lewis. And David Lewis had kind of gotten the concept. He understood he was a New Zealander, one of the great sailors New Zealand's produced. He was learning how to navigate traditionally. And David Lewis had intellectually gotten it. He understood what was going on. And Mau had asked him, yes, but can you see the island? He goes, yeah, no, I know how to, I watch the birds, I watch the stars. And he goes, can you see the island? Right. Do you really believe, do you really know? Right. There's a level of commitment and urgency that comes with that. And that's the urgency that drives change. You have to see the island. You have to see the change that you're trying to enact. Otherwise, we risk making just small changes, right? Marginal changes at 1 or 2% a year. these population changes are not happening at 1 or 2% a year, right? And we're already behind. Our babies are already ahead of us. You know, what do we do to catch up? So we have to rethink a gradual approach to it, because it won't get us there. And we have to rethink what it means around some of the things we're driving for. So diversity is something that's often put out. I'm not a fan of that way of phrasing it, because of what sits behind diversity. And inclusion, what sits behind inclusion. Most of the inclusion we do is inclusion on a certain set of terms, right? And the terms themselves aren't up for contest. It's kind of time we actually put the terms of inclusion up for contest, right? Very few people are in as much demand as a gifted young Māori leader, for instance. If you want them, you're going to have to chase them hard, right? The old rules won't apply. With that will come all sorts of innovations. I want to leave time for questions, so I won't go through these individually. But one of the things we see, for instance, with David Dallas, along with the generations of Pacific hip-hoppers that came before him, was pure innovation. They took an African-American vernacular music and culture, and they transformed it in the context of New Zealand, largely in South Auckland, right? One of the great sort of cultural revolutions happened very quietly, driven by 20-year-olds. And now most New Zealanders don't even notice it. Same thing happened in the movie industry, right? I've pointed out that 8 of the top 10 grossing movies in New Zealand's history are by or about Māori and Pacific people, right? 8 of 10, 80%. So the question we might ask if we're funding movies is not why would we fund Māori and Pacific movies, it's really why would we fund anything else? You know, that's what people actually want to watch. So innovation is going to come from these young people because they're not going to wait for old people to make opportunities for them, right? They have choices. We see whole new markets being formed by Pacific and Māori communities. One of them, my favourite one for this example, is Otahu, you know, about 6 kilometres from here. A thriving, working class main street, 2.5 kilometres from New Zealand's largest mall, when every other main street has been hollowed out and shut down by a new shopping mall. Otahu is thriving because it sells things you can buy in Otahu you could never buy at a Westfield Mall or Sylvia Park, right? This is what innovation looks like. With a limited capital base, driven by creativity, by relationships, and by the foreclosure of so many other opportunities, young people and Pacific people and their Māori cousins have driven kinds of innovation that we should watch and learn from. You know, if we think, how do we engage with Pacific people? Well, how about we just watch what Pacific people do to engage with each other, right? We don't have to invent an answer. The answer is already there. We maybe just have to borrow it. And this Pacific peoples is transforming fast. Young Pacific people are actually not like old Pacific people. And that's something that old Pacific people have to come to terms with, that those young Pacific people are more likely to be born in New Zealand. They're more likely to have English as their first language. They're more likely to have very strong and marked gender inequalities. They're more likely to tick no religion when people ask them what their religion is. You know, haven't seen those numbers from the recent census, but in the last one, almost a third of young Pacific people ticked no religion, right? Churches aren't the answer that they once were, and where the churches are the answer, it's a different church. Young Pacific people are also far more likely to tick more than one box when you ask who they are. They're going to tick Pacific and Māori, which is very, very common now, increasingly common. Pacific and Pākehā, Pacific and Asian, right? Our young people are changing fast. And so the final thing I wanted to finish on was just to talk about, because LIANZA, one of the reasons I'm here singing for my supper is I'm singing for a particular project. And so my speaker's fee will be going to this project. And this is a project which is a book, but it's also a digital project. It'll be out probably by the end of November. It's a high school textbook written by myself and some of my students. So for Pacific, by Pacific, it is called Pacific Studies for Young Pacific People, right? It is about putting words by Pacific people in front of young Pacific readers and by connecting them to their stories, right? So about a third of the book is history, but it's history of the present. So in our book, you will see the history of Manurewa, you will see the history of Porirua, of Logan in Queensland, of Inglewood in Los Angeles. Pacific places where young Pacific people live. It's a book that there'll be enough money, thanks to LIANZA, to have hard copies for some of the Pacific high schools around this part of Auckland, schools that are almost entirely Pacific students. But we will also be distributing it free online, so it'll be a PDF available online, and we'll be having teacher workshops. So we're really excited by the commitment to, many of you will know, the New Zealand history commitment that's been made, also included Pacific histories as well. And then we have a social enterprise model, which is we will also sell copies, and if you buy a copy, we will bank a copy to give to a school. So what we're trying to do is to take out the commercial element of decisions about what is made for textbooks. So some of my students didn't like my title. They didn't want to put for young Pacific people. They wanted to just call it an introduction to Pacific studies, because they wanted it to be for everyone. And I said to them, every book is for everyone. And actually what that means is it's really just for someone who's not a Pacific person. And so I wanted a book that when a 16-year-old kid at Manurewa High School, just around the corner here, or a 17-year-old one at Sir Edmund Hillary Collegiate picks it up, they know that we did it just for them. So I thank LIANZA and all of you for your contribution to this project, and look forward to your support when it comes out. Whawhatai lava.
Tai te lava lau pionga Toeolesulusulu, Damon Salesa. You've given us a lot of things to think about and to reflect on in terms of the changes. Have we seen the changes, and have we experienced the rain from Manua that has happened, the future that has happened, and the future that we can help, we can make happen, because we are LIANZA, of course. We are LIANZA, and some of the things that the perspectives that you provided for us this afternoon is to look at, what are our communities. The theme of the conference is about is our families, our communities, our libraries. And just by engaging with our communities, whatever communities, with specific Māori or other ethnic minorities, is that what Toeolesulusulu Damon is saying is that when we engage with what they're doing, we're experiencing the stuff that we can then apply in what's relevant to them, what's relevant to Pacific communities, the history of the literacy from the Bible. Some Pacific families, is that something that we could have stories, Bible stories in libraries, things that older people can come in and engage with the younger ones, and using the digital environment, social media. Are we on Facebook? Do we have platforms where the young Pacific people are engaging in? So a lot of those things that we already know that's there, but it's for us to embrace those, because we are LIANZA. So whawhatai tele. Damon's books are also in the the stall out there where the university stall. They've got some of his books, and I think he might be available there to sign some of the books. So if you're, so do please have a look at some of those books. And without further ado, we want to present you with gift of books that LIANZA has collected for your project, as well as, I think, your speaking fee that you have donated to that project. So, whawhetai te le lava. Hiwa kai.